Welcome to the video, everybody. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from, because over the past several weeks, the United States military has thrown an almost unbelievable amount of firepower at Iran, night after night, wave after wave, hitting everything from missile storage bunkers to drone facilities to command centers buried underground. That's not hyperbole or dramatic framing for the sake of a good headline either. The actual scale of what's been carried out over this specific stretch of the war genuinely warrants that kind of language. Dozens of separate strike packages, hundreds of individual targets, and a level of sustained tempo that most modern military campaigns simply never reach, night after night, across nearly every corner of the country. And yet, after all of that, after dozens of separate strike packages and hundreds of individual targets destroyed, the single site everyone actually wants to know about is still sitting there, untouched, buried under a mountain, waiting. So let's break down exactly how much firepower has actually been unleashed on Iran over these past few weeks, what's still standing despite all of it, and why Washington just made a dramatic, telling shift in strategy that tells you everything about how this entire campaign has actually gone so far. Let's start with the most recent, most intense major wave, because it genuinely captures just how intense this specific stretch of the war has become. In the days after Iran launched a missile attack targeting an American base in Jordan, President Trump ordered Central Command to resume the bombing campaign he'd paused just 5 days earlier to give diplomacy one more chance. That pause itself was significant. 13 consecutive nights of strikes had already been carried out before Trump called a halt, opening what officials described as a brief window specifically intended to give negotiators one more shot at reaching some kind of settlement before things escalated any further, a window that, in hindsight, turned out to be far shorter-lived than anyone involved had probably hoped. Iran's missile attack on the Jordan base shattered that window almost immediately, and within 5 days, the entire campaign was back in full swing, an escalation cycle that's honestly become one of the defining rhythms of this entire war. Strikes pause for diplomacy. Iran tests that pause with an attack of its own, and the bombing resumes almost as quickly as it stopped, a pattern that's repeated itself often enough by now that seasoned observers of this conflict could probably predict the broad shape of it in advance. What followed was described by officials as a heavy wave of airstrikes across Iran, hitting targets right as the sun went down, with Central Command putting out video footage almost immediately afterward, showing the scale of the destruction. That timing wasn't accidental either. Striking right at dusk gives American aircraft the advantage of operating during the transition into darkness, when Iranian air defense crews have to adjust between daytime and nighttime targeting procedures, a window that strike planners have clearly learned to exploit repeatedly throughout this campaign. At the time of that strike, more than 50,000 American service members were already deployed across the region, described by Central Command as highly vigilant, focused, lethal, and ready language that tells you this wasn't some limited symbolic gesture. It was a fully resourced, fully committed military campaign operating at genuine wartime tempo, with enough personnel and equipment in theater to sustain exactly this kind of rapid, aggressive response whenever it was called for. And that wave built directly on top of an already staggering campaign that had been running for weeks before it. Just days earlier, Central Command had launched strikes described as hitting more than 80 separate targets with precision munitions in a single operation lasting roughly 4 hours, striking Iranian air defense systems, coastal surveillance networks, surface-to-air missile batteries, anti-ship cruise missiles, and drone launch sites all in one coordinated sweep. That specific target list is worth sitting with for a second, because it wasn't random. Every single category on it represents exactly the kind of capability Iran would need to actually threaten shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz or defend itself against follow-up strikes, meaning this wasn't simply punitive destruction for its own sake. It was a methodical attempt to strip away Iran's ability to retaliate or interfere with commercial vessels transiting the region. You can trace an almost surgical logic through the entire target list once you actually break it down piece by piece, disable the radars first, then the missile batteries that depend on those radars, then the drone launch sites that need clear airspace to operate, each category feeding directly into the next, in a sequence clearly designed by planners who understood exactly how these different systems work together as a single integrated defense network. Iranian military leaders responded to that specific wave by pledging what they called a crushing response, vowing they would not allow foreign interference in how the Strait of Hormuz gets managed going forward. That kind of rhetoric had become almost a fixture of this war by this point, a predictable beat in the cycle that follows nearly every major American strike. Iran publicly promising overwhelming retaliation, followed by an actual response that, while genuinely disruptive and occasionally lethal, has rarely matched the scale of the language used to describe it in advance. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps followed through on at least part of that promise, claiming it had targeted 85 American military sites across Bahrain and Kuwait, in direct response to the American strikes, while Iran's regular army said separately that a drone attack had targeted American forces at the Sheikh Issa air base in Bahrain. Iranian state television reported 6 separate explosions on Qeshm Island alone, the largest island near the Strait of Hormuz and one of the most strategically significant pieces of territory in the entire country, given its position controlling access to that critical waterway. Local reports described shrapnel injuries at a commercial pier in Sirak, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed it shot down an American MQ-9 reconnaissance drone over southern Iran during the exchange, evidence that even as American strikes overwhelmingly dominated these encounters, Iran wasn't simply absorbing the damage without any response of its own. It's also worth noting that this particular round of strikes happened to coincide with President Trump attending the NATO summit in Turkey, a scheduling overlap that meant American allies were watching this exact escalation unfold in real time, right alongside their own discussions about broader alliance commitments and regional security. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, go ahead and drop a like and make sure you're subscribed, because we're going to keep tracking exactly how this war continues to escalate. And there's a genuinely important twist coming at the end of this one that changes the entire picture. Now, let's talk about just how sustained this bombing campaign has actually been, because the numbers here are honestly staggering once you lay them all out together. Central Command has publicly confirmed running strikes on 11 consecutive nights during one stretch of this campaign, targeting Iranian military command centers, drone storage facilities, and logistics infrastructure up and down the country. Iran's own state-run news agency reported that American strikes killed at least one person around Tabriz, a city believed to host underground missile bases operated by the Revolutionary Guard, and reporting indicated additional strikes likely hit targets at Bandar Imam Khomeini, Sirak, Jask, Konarak, and Chabahar, a genuinely enormous geographic spread covering multiple provinces along Iran's southern coastline in a single sustained campaign. Tabriz in particular is worth noting specifically, because it sits roughly 325 miles from Tehran itself, a considerable distance, meaning American targeting wasn't confined to the areas immediately surrounding the capital or the coastline nearest the strait. It extended deep into Iran's northwestern territory as well, hitting infrastructure that Revolutionary Guard forces had presumably assumed sat far enough from the main theater of conflict to remain relatively safe. Let's put that into real perspective for a second, because 11 consecutive nights of strikes isn't a single dramatic raid. It's a sustained air campaign on a scale that most modern conflicts never actually reach. Every single one of those nights required coordinated tanker support, target identification, munitions loading, aircrew rotation, and battle damage assessment. An enormous logistical machine running continuously behind the scenes to keep that pace of operations sustainable night after night without any of it breaking down. Think about what that actually demands from the people and systems supporting it. Pilots flying repeated combat sorties night after night without extended rest, maintenance crews keeping aircraft mission ready under constant operational tempo, and intelligence analysts working around the clock just to confirm what got hit and what still needs to be struck the following night. An enormous, largely invisible workforce making sure the far more visible strike footage keeps coming night after night without interruption. And this wasn't happening in isolation either. The United States also struck bridges and a tower at an Iranian port during the same stretch, expanding the target set beyond purely military infrastructure and into the broader transportation network Iran depends on to move goods, personnel, and equipment around the country, a signal that the campaign's objectives had broadened well beyond simply degrading Iran's immediate combat capability toward disrupting its longer-term logistical resilience as well. Now let's talk about the threat that's been looming over this entire campaign, because it's arguably the most consequential piece of this whole story. For weeks, President Trump has repeatedly threatened to strike a site known as Pickaxe Mountain, officially called Ku-e-Kolangazla, a heavily fortified underground facility sitting on the south side of Iran's Natanz nuclear complex. Trump told reporters directly that the United States would be hitting that area very probably pretty soon, adding bluntly that there wasn't a thing Iran could do about it, that kind of specific, direct threat. Naming an actual facility rather than speaking in vague generalities about future strikes is genuinely unusual in how it's been handled publicly, and it's kept this one site at the absolute center of speculation about where this war goes next for weeks now. And here's what makes this specific site so significant. Unlike Fordo, which American B-2 bombers already struck with a dozen bunker-busting bombs back in the summer of 2025, Pickaxe Mountain has remained completely untouched throughout this entire war, even as Iran has continued actively digging and expanding the site the entire time. Analysts examining the site's history have noted that it hasn't been targeted in either the original 2025 conflict or the current war that reignited in February, aside from what appears to have been the incidental destruction of a single vehicle on a nearby spoil pile, likely tied to some other nearby strike, rather than a deliberate attempt to hit the mountain complex itself. That track record months of active construction with essentially zero direct interference, tells you Iran has had an unusually long, uninterrupted window to keep building out exactly the kind of protection the specific facility would need to survive the eventual attack everyone assumes is coming. Satellite imagery analysis has tracked exactly what Iran has been doing at that site in real time, and it paints a genuinely alarming picture. Reports from independent nuclear watchdog organizations describe rock and soil being deliberately pushed back and leveled on top of tunnel portals at the eastern entrances, along with the newly added concrete reinforced headworks specifically designed to allow additional layers of rock, soil, or concrete to be piled on top for extra protection against exactly the kind of airstrike everyone expects is eventually coming. Analysts have noted piles of construction materials sitting visibly near the tunnel entrances in recent satellite passes, a level of transparency that almost suggests Iran isn't even trying particularly hard to hide the fact that reinforcement work is actively underway. Perhaps because the country has calculated that the strike is coming regardless of how much effort goes into concealment. So the more productive use of time and resources is simply racing to finish the actual physical hardening before that moment arrives. In other words, while the rest of Iran has been absorbing strike after strike for weeks, the one facility that arguably matters most for the country's ability to ever rebuild a nuclear weapons program has been getting actively hardened in real time. Construction materials visibly stockpiled near the entrances as Iranian engineers race to finish reinforcing it before American bombers show up. Here's why Pickaxe Mountain represents such a fundamentally different challenge than anything American forces have hit so far in this war. The mountain itself stands roughly 650 meters tall, more than 50% higher than the mountain covering Fordo, which means potentially even greater natural protection layered on top of everything Iran has been actively adding through construction. That height difference alone matters enormously in bunker-busting calculations, because the effectiveness of a penetrating weapon depends heavily on exactly how much material it needs to punch through before it can actually reach anything worth destroying, and an extra 50% of solid rock represents a genuinely significant increase in the total barrier any weapon would need to overcome. And there's an even more specific technical detail that matters enormously here. Satellite footage has shown that this facility appears to have only a single ventilation shaft, compared to the at least two that existed at Fordo. That distinction is genuinely critical, because the entire American strike doctrine used against Fordo specifically depended on using an initial round of bombs to blast away the protective covers on those shafts before follow-up weapons could actually descend through the newly exposed openings and reach the underground complex itself. General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, explained in a press briefing following the 2025 strikes that the entire aerial strategy behind the 12 bombs dropped on Fordo revolved specifically around those ventilation shafts, first destroying the covers Iran had placed over them, then sending subsequent weapons directly through those now open pathways to reach deep into the facility. With only one shaft to work with instead of two, the margin for error on an actual strike against Pickaxe Mountain shrinks considerably, and any mistake or malfunction on that single point of entry could mean the difference between a successful strike and a failed one against the country's most protected remaining nuclear site. There's also a genuinely uncomfortable question hanging over the entire situation, because nobody outside of Iran's own government actually knows for certain what's stored inside that mountain right now. United Nations nuclear inspectors have never been granted access to the site, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has been unable to independently verify Iran's centrifuge capacity and production levels since 2021, meaning Tehran could plausibly be sitting on reserves and capabilities that the outside world simply has no confirmed visibility into. The agency's Director General has separately confirmed that roughly 200 kilograms of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile are believed to remain stored in deep tunnels at a related nuclear complex outside Isfahan, additional quantities beyond what's specifically tied to Pickaxe Mountain, which gives you a sense of just how dispersed and difficult to fully track Iran's remaining nuclear material actually is, even after everything that's already been destroyed throughout this war. Iran is believed to possess somewhere close to 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium, material that sits right at the edge of weapons-grade purity. And American officials have said explicitly that securing or neutralizing that specific material, rather than any particular building or tunnel complex, is what actually matters most strategically. As Trump himself put it when asked directly about the site, he said the country follows the material, meaning wherever that enriched uranium physically sits is the real target, regardless of which mountain happens to be covering it at any given moment. That framing is worth sitting with, because it suggests the ultimate American objective was never really about destroying a specific piece of geography. It's about tracking and eventually neutralizing a finite, specific quantity of dangerous material that could theoretically be moved, hidden, or redistributed to entirely different locations if Iran felt threatened enough to try relocating it before any strike actually happens. Let's talk honestly about whether the United States even has enough of the right weapons left to actually pull off a strike like this if the order ever comes down, because it's a genuinely serious operational question. The bomb capable of reaching a facility like Pickaxe Mountain is the same 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator used against Fordo back in 2025. And reporting has confirmed the Air Force has already placed new orders to replenish that specific stockpile following the strikes carried out earlier in this war. There's actually a mixed picture buried in that detail worth appreciating. On one hand, the fact that new orders weren't placed immediately after the original 2025 strikes, and that those orders are specifically for the same proven weapon, rather than some entirely new, unproven larger design, suggests planners are reasonably confident in the existing capability, rather than scrambling to invent something entirely new under pressure. That's actually a meaningful signal in military procurement terms. When a weapons program sticks with a design that's already been tested successfully in combat, rather than rushing to develop something bigger or more powerful, it usually means the existing tool is still considered adequate for the job at hand, at least for now. On the other hand, if the military had ordered additional bombs immediately after 2025 and hadn't needed to wait until this current war forced the issue, there might not be any lingering concern at all about whether enough weapons exist for another operation of this scale, whether that operation targets Tehran directly or a facility as challenging as Pickaxe Mountain. The timing of when those replacement orders actually got placed tells its own story about how urgently the Pentagon views the current stockpile situation, and it's a detail that's easy to miss buried inside the broader headlines about troop deployments and nightly strike totals, but it matters enormously for anyone trying to seriously assess how prepared the United States actually is to finish the job it's been threatening for weeks now. And that brings us to the twist that's actually defining this entire moment in the war right now, because after everything, 11 consecutive nights of strikes, more than 80 targets hit in a single sweep, 50,000 troops deployed across the region, repeated threats to finally hit Pickaxe Mountain directly, the administration has just pivoted toward an entirely different approach. Just this week, President Trump declared what he's calling economic warfare against Iran, vowing to isolate the regime financially in an explicit attempt to achieve, through economic pressure, what months of direct military strikes have, in his own framing, so far failed to fully accomplish, forcing Iran's actual capitulation. That's a genuinely remarkable admission buried inside an otherwise aggressive-sounding announcement, an acknowledgement, even if not stated in exactly those words, that the bombing campaign, for all its intensity and sustained tempo, hasn't yet delivered the kind of decisive outcome the administration had originally been hoping for when this current phase of the war first reignited back in early July. The Treasury Secretary confirmed additional economic measures targeting Iran, and any entities with commercial ties to the country would be announced within days, while the United Arab Emirates has reportedly begun preparing its own phased trade and financial restrictions to run in parallel with whatever new American measures get rolled out. That kind of coordinated multinational rollout, rather than the United States simply acting alone, suggests this economic pivot has been in the works for some time rather than being a hastily improvised reaction, with allied governments already lined up and ready to implement their own complementary restrictions the moment Washington's own measures get formally announced. Getting multiple sovereign governments to align their own separate financial and trade policies around a single coordinated timeline is itself a genuinely difficult diplomatic achievement, one that typically takes weeks or months of quiet negotiation well before any of it ever becomes public. Sit with that shift for a second because it's genuinely significant. Trump warned publicly that countries would face what he called tremendous economic consequences if their financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities provided any kind of lifeline to Iran. Language that goes well beyond simply pressuring Iran itself and instead threatens secondary consequences for any third country or company anywhere in the world that keeps doing business with Iran. That kind of secondary sanctions threat is designed to work almost like a net thrown far wider than Iran's own borders, forcing banks, shipping companies, and governments in countries with no direct stake in this war to nonetheless calculate whether continuing any relationship with Iran is still worth the risk of losing access to American markets and financial systems altogether. That's the exact same maximum pressure playbook the administration first employed back in 2018 and then reinstated again in 2025, a strategy built around economic isolation rather than direct military confrontation. The fact that Washington is now leaning so heavily back into that older playbook, after everything this current military campaign has already thrown at Iran, tells you something important about how the administration itself is assessing the results of months of direct strikes. Iran, for its part, has been characteristically defiant in its public response to this new economic pressure, with officials dismissing the threats and insisting the country is, in their own words, well acquainted with sanctions after decades of living under various forms of economic restriction already. That's not an unreasonable position for Iran to take either. The country has weathered sanctions regimes for the better part of half a century at this point, building an entire parallel economic infrastructure specifically designed to route around exactly this kind of pressure. Alternative banking channels, discounted oil sales to buyers willing to look past Western restrictions, and smuggling networks that have proven remarkably resilient over decades of accumulated experience evading exactly this kind of enforcement. Iranian officials have also been actively working to identify and shift toward alternative trade routes and destinations for their oil exports, specifically to blunt the impact of this renewed economic pressure. A pragmatic response that reflects genuine institutional experience managing exactly this kind of squeeze rather than simply hoping the pressure eventually eases on its own. An approach shaped by decades of officials inside the Iranian government who have spent their entire careers learning how to root around exactly this kind of external financial pressure. That said, defiant rhetoric and decades of accumulated sanctions experience only go so far when the pressure keeps compounding on top of an economy that's already been strained by months of active warfare, a naval blockade that's already cut deeply into oil export revenue, and the ongoing cost of sustaining military operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. Every additional sanction announcement adds one more layer of difficulty on top of a financial system that was already under considerable stress well before this latest round of measures even got announced this week. But here's the honest, balanced read on what this pivot actually tells us about the state of this entire war right now. It's not that the military campaign has failed outright. 11 consecutive nights of strikes, more than 80 targets destroyed in a single operation, sustained pressure across nearly every Iranian coastal city that matters strategically. That's an objectively massive amount of damage inflicted over a relatively short window of time. Any honest assessment has to give real credit to just how much destruction has actually been carried out. Entire categories of Iranian military capability, air defense, coastal surveillance, drone storage, missile launch infrastructure have been repeatedly targeted and degraded across dozens of separate locations, spanning the length of the country's coastline and well into its interior. But it clearly hasn't been enough on its own to force the kind of unconditional capitulation the administration has been publicly hoping for, and the fact that Pickaxe Mountain, arguably the single most consequential remaining target in the entire country, still sits untouched and actively being reinforced even now, tells you there are real limits, whether operational, political, or some combination of both, on how far this specific military campaign has actually been allowed to go. That gap between the sheer volume of destruction already inflicted and the actual strategic outcome the administration originally set out to achieve is precisely the gap this new economic warfare announcement is designed to try closing instead. Let's talk about what happens if these two tracks, military pressure and economic pressure, end up running in parallel rather than one simply replacing the other, because that's genuinely the most likely scenario going forward. Nothing in Trump's economic warfare announcement suggested the military option was being taken off the table entirely, and given how many times this specific war has cycled between pauses and renewed strikes already, treating this pivot as a permanent shift away from direct military action would probably be a mistake. It reads much more like an additional layer of pressure being stacked on top of everything already happening, rather than a replacement for it. Iran now has to simultaneously worry about its economy getting further strangled through sanctions and secondary enforcement, while also knowing that the threat of American bombers finally turning their attention to Pickaxe Mountain, or resuming another sustained bombing campaign against any of the dozens of other targets still standing, remains very much alive in the background. There's also a broader strategic logic worth appreciating here, because economic pressure and military pressure actually complement each other in ways that make the combination more effective than either approach used entirely on its own. Sanctions and financial isolation work slowly, grinding down a country's ability to fund its military, pay its soldiers, and maintain its infrastructure over months and years, rather than delivering the kind of dramatic, immediate results a missile strike produces. Military pressure, on the other hand, can force short-term tactical decisions and demonstrate resolve in a way that a wire transfer restriction never could, but it also carries real costs. Munitions get consumed, aircraft need maintenance, and there are always political limits on how long any government can sustain public support for an active bombing campaign without some visible sign of progress toward an actual resolution. Combining both approaches lets Washington apply constant pressure through one channel while giving the other channel room to breathe and regroup, which might explain the timing of this pivot as much as anything else happening on the battlefield itself. It also gives the administration a genuinely useful political tool at home, a way to show continued toughness toward Iran even during any future pause in direct strikes, without that pause ever being mistaken for weakness or loss of resolve by anyone watching how this entire war continues to unfold. So let's think through where this actually leaves things right now, because it's worth being honest about the genuine uncertainty hanging over the rest of this war. Iran is simultaneously facing a tightening economic noose, specifically designed to cut off the money that funds its military and its proxy network, while still living under the constant threat that the single most protected, most strategically important site left in the entire country could get struck at essentially any moment without warning. That's an extraordinarily difficult position for any government to manage indefinitely, trying to keep the economy functioning well enough to maintain basic stability at home, while also trying to finish hardening your most sensitive remaining facility fast enough to survive an attack that could come at any time. Every additional week, Pickaxe Mountain remains untouched. It's another week Iranian engineers get to keep reinforcing it, but it's also another week the broader economic pressure campaign gets to keep tightening in the background, squeezing the resources Iran would need to actually finish that reinforcement work in the first place. It's genuinely a race running on two separate tracks at once, one measured in the pace of construction crews and satellite imagery updates, the other measured in bank transfers, sanctions filings, and oil buyers quietly deciding whether continuing to do business with Tehran is still worth the growing risk. What do you think happens next in this war? Do you think this shift toward economic warfare is a genuine change in strategy, or just a temporary pause, before American bombers finally do turn their attention to Pickaxe Mountain directly? It's a genuinely open question, and honestly one that seems to shift depending on which week you're asking it, given how many times this war has already cycled between periods of intense military pressure and quieter stretches of diplomacy or economic maneuvering over the past several months alone. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear your take on where this goes from here and what you personally expect to happen in the coming weeks, especially given how many times this exact pattern of escalation followed by a strategic pivot has already played out over the course of this war. And if you found this breakdown useful, make sure you're subscribed and sharing it with anyone trying to keep track of just how much firepower has actually been thrown at Iran these past few weeks, and why the one target everybody's actually watching still hasn't been touched, because between the strikes already carried out and the ones still being threatened, this war is clearly far from finished. Thanks so much for watching. We genuinely appreciate you sticking with this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the next one.